think well worth it. So I'm going to tell you some things about John. John Tauranac.
Margaret, wait a minute. They're still buying books over there.
Oh, shall I wait?
Yeah, because
Or
they're
you can
talking.
be quiet.
You want me to
You want them to be quiet?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yes, boss.
No, really.
I'm videoing this.
Yes, it is. And you're
No
right.
fighting, I'm videoing this.
Oh, you're not.
I am, yes, I'm recording right now.
Oh. Erase it. Delete it.
Only in Cornwall.
Okay, I think I'm okay. So John Tauranac writes on New York City's social and architectural history. He teaches the subject at NYU School of Professional Studies. He gives lectures and tours, and he designs maps. His books include the Empire State Building, The Making of a Landmark, and the 3 editions of New York from the Air, which he does with the great aerial photographer Jan Arthus Bertrand. And of course, this book that he's going to be talking about today. His first published maps were New York Magazine's undercover maps, which showed how to navigate undercover passageways through and under buildings in Midtown and Lower Manhattan. Maintaining his mole's eye perspective, he was the creative director of the 1979 MTA subway map, and he's still designing maps, including Manhattan block by block, a street atlas, which the Times said offers just about all the critical information a tale seeker might need, and then some. Tauranac was awarded a commendation for design excellence by the National Endowment for the Arts and the U.S. Department of Transportation for his contribution to the official subway map in 1981. He was named a Centennial Historian of the City by New York by the Mayor's Office for his work in history in 1998. And the School of Professional Studies presented him with the Great Teachers Award in 2010. He lives on Manhattan's Upper West Side and Cornwall with his wife, Jane Bevins, an artist and lawyer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. I do not say that I live in Cornwall in the book, because I don't want the landlord to know.
Oh, of course.
So welcome. I'm going to try to talk about some. I know that the flyer said that I was going to read from the book, but I'm not. I'm going to make it up as I go along. I'm being told that this has to be louder. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, no, maybe. Can we, Margaret is the techno channel.
Yeah.
Louder, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll keep talking, and when the volume reaches a point where you... Hey. All right. So, I'm going to start with this red brick stable at 33 Crank Jones Street. And this is where Bernard Beinecke built some stables. Beinecke was a wholesale butcher whose career began in New York as a 19-year-old German immigrant in 1865. Some of his business by the 1870s included making deliveries directly to his clients. So he figured, I need a stable. He needed horse-drawn wagons as delivery vans, along with a place to house them, which explains this 3-story stable between the Bowery and what is now Lafayette Street. Some of you in the audience know this block pretty well. Francis and Casper Loard and their family. Whoops. See? Say the magic word and the contraption falls. I was techno-jerk at one point. So is this working?
Yes.
Let's pray. All right, so the Loards live on this block, and here's a map this is called a land map from 1894. And the building in question, whoops, my pointer doesn't work on that machine, but do you see the building at 33 with the X through it? In land maps, an X through a building means that it's a stable. If it is the color pink, it's brick. If it's yellow, it's made of wood. And if it has a brownstone blob on the front, that means retains it as a brownstone facade. So this is how the block looked in 1894. And this is really how the block looked in 1894. On your right is the north-south is the Bowery, and on your left is Broadway. And that narrow, what looks like a little narrow L-shaped street is Shinbone Alley, and still there.
Where's Shinbone Alley?
The white one.
You see that just to the right of Broadway, you see a vertical line here.
Oh, yeah.
You see it? Okay.
Under
Now people who know this block are going to say, so where's Lafayette Street? Since this pointer isn't working, I will get up there and demonstrate. Here's Broadway. This is Crosby Street. This is Mulberry. And this street that ends at Jersey Street was Elm Street, E-L-M. And if you look up the top, you'll see where there's the O-N-E in Jones. Another north-south street begins. That was Lafayette Place. And here you see Lafayette Place going vertically from Great Jones Street. But it ended there, or began there, depending on your perspective. Lafayette Street had some very grand houses on it, built in the 1840s. This is Colonnade Row, and about a half of it is still standing. The southern half got knocked down by Wanamaker's when they wanted to put a warehouse there. And this is how the street configuration looks today. And you see, Great Jones Street is up at the top there. And from the left to the right, you see Broadway. Then you see Lafayette Street, and parenthetically, Elm Street, because Elm Street was extended north to link up with Lafayette Place. Why? Because in the 1900s, they were building the city's first successful subway. And the shop owners and real estate people on Broadway did not want to have Broadway torn up because it would have been the death of businesses. So they created a street called Lafayette Street in order to accommodate the subway. And this is the subway was called the cut and cover method. We only have a curator from the Transit Museum in the audience, so I better be careful about what he's done. The cut and cover was the most efficient and expedient, but the most deleterious to traffic, because they literally dug a trench and they covered it temporarily, but still it was a mess. The building you see on the right was a mission house and an orphanage. And the building on 4th Street, which you see with the triple arches, that still stands. That was the Davini Press building, and it was one of the great buildings from the 19th century. If we look at this map again, extend Elm Street. Remember, this is Elm Street here, and it was created to join up with Lafayette Place. What happened to this building here? And all the buildings along there, they were torn down. And the Puck building on Mulberry and Houston Street found that its west wall was going to be demolished in order to make way for the subway. So what did they do? They built a new west wall. And the wall that you see on the right was built in the early 20th century. And Ingrid Boyum Ellen, who some of you know, teaches at the Wagner School at NYU, and the Wagner School is in the Puck building. And it used to have a cage elevator. It was a splendid elevator, but it's gone now. This is Bernard Beinecke in the 1890s. He does not look like the friendliest man, does he? But he was all business. And in the 1890s, he owned the Eastman's Dressed Beef Company, which was on 11th Avenue between 58th and 59th Streets. It was the largest slaughterhouse in the city, and he processed meat. And the largest cattle yard was just north of it on the Hudson.
Imagine.
Now, Beinecke realized that although he was supplying seagoing ships with meat and many of the major institutions and hotels in the city, he thought that he could probably make more money if instead of just supplying hotels with victuals, he owned a hotel or two. So he built the Manhattan Hotel on the northwest corner of 42nd Street and Vanderbilt Avenue, and he had no less than Henry J. Hardenbergh design it. Hardenbergh was the architect of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel when it was on 34th and 5th. Then, because the Manhattan was successful, he built an extension to 43rd Street, also designed by Hardenbergh. And these sculptures were on the 43rd Street roof line. The building is now gone, was torn down in the 50s. In fact, in the 1920s, it became the Midtown office for First National City Bank. And why would a hotel have become a bank, had gone out of business basically in the 20s? Prohibition. It killed the Manhattan Hotel, it killed the Knickerbocker Hotel on Times Square. Dozens of hotels went out of business because hotels are dependent on the receipts from restaurants, and restaurants are dependent on the receipts from bars. With no liquor sales, no receipts, no profits, out of business. Simple as that. Then in 1900, the Manhattan was still going strong in 1900. Bernard Beinecke bought this hotel. It was built in 1890. The architects were McKinley and White, perhaps the most prestigious, not perhaps, the most prestigious architects in the United States in the last quarter of the 19th century and into the 20th. Does anybody recognize this building?
It's not there anymore.
The street that we see leading off is 59th Street, aka Central Park South these days. Right in front of us is Fifth Avenue. That's the First Plaza Hotel on the south. Well,
First Plaza.
It's not there anymore. It was replaced.
somebody have a question?
It was replaced by another building. It was replaced.
That'll come in good time.
Yeah.
Then in about 1900, he joined a man who built the Fuller Building. Does anybody know this by the Fuller Building?
No.
You know it as the and they joined forces and they created the United States Realty Company. And this is today's Fuller Building on the northeast corner of 57th and Madison. And in the lobby, you find this mosaic in the floor, which prompts an entry in the book. But back to Beinecke. He and Harry Black, his partner in the United States Realty Company, met with John Betamillion Gates and had tea together. That's probably a euphemism for what they really drank at the St. Regis Hotel. Remember John Betamillion Gates? He made a fortune in the barbed wire business, and he was said to be a great gambler to the point where if he was on a train and he was bored, he would bet with somebody. If it was raining, he would bet with somebody which droplet of rain reached the bottom of the pane first. But apparently John Betamillion Rebellion Gates was a much more sensible man than that apocryphal story. They decided that they wanted to replace the McKinley and White Plaza, and they met, the Beinecke and Black met with Gates at the St. Regis, and together they began to solidify plans for a new Plaza Hotel. And this is it. Beinecke saw that Hardenberg was hired again, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. Henry J. Hardenberg's name is there. And U.S. Realty went on to build the Copley Plaza in Boston and the Savoy Plaza in New York, which was across, which the Tents was torn down to make way for the GM building. It was across the plaza from the plaza, and by the time the Savoy Plaza opened in 1928, Beinecke was in his 80s, and according to his grandson, Beinecke had been opposed to the construction of the Savoy Plaza, which was, as his grandson said, built in a wave of enthusiasm in the late 1920s. You know, the building after building was planned in the boom of the 20s, only to open in the bust of the 30s. The Depression set in, said the grandson, and my grandfather, who had moved to the plaza, sat in the window in his last years and watched everything go. He ended up the way he started. He ended up broke. Oh, broke is a relative term. The family retained an interest in Fuller, the U.S. Realty Company, which was the largest building construction company in the United States. And it was part of the consortium that built, for instance, that built the United Nations. And one member of the second generation Beinecke's founded Sperry and Hutchinson, which distributed S&H green stamps, the trading stamps that grocery stores used to hand out instead of discounts. The third generation of Beinecke's created a memorial to the second generation of Beinecke's, the children of Bernard Beinecke. They built a library at Yale, a school that has made the news lately, which Walter Beinecke Jr. modestly described as being rather well known. The Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, here illustrated by Adam Van Dorn in this wonderful book, The Stones of Yale. We now travel to Washington Square. This is a door in the west end of Washington Arch, and up 100 steps to the roof, and we have the setting for the Washington Arch conspirators, who in 1917 declared a free and sovereign Republic of Greenwich Village. It was a free and sovereign republic from big business and small minds. And it's here depicted by John Sloan, who was one of the perpetrators of this rebellion. And there was a story in a recent Metropolitan section of the Times on the demise of the Village Voice, and 7 subjects that the paper covered in depth that changed New York. And this was one of them. This was the proposal by Robert Moses to build a highway beginning in Washington Square to link up with his proposed elevated highways for Lower Manhattan. His proposal sank, thanks to community opposition. The Voice called it the revolt of the Urbs, URBS. But the buildings that lined the east side of what was then still called West Broadway were felled before Moses' plan could be. What went up on the northern 2/3 of the site was Washington Square Village, which before landscaping, etc., was pretty bleak. The north-south street was still called West Broadway, which would have been the extension of the road through the park, and widened, of course. It became, north of Houston Street, LaGuardia Place. The strip along the west side of Washington Square Village needed some touch of humanity. statue of Mayor Fiorillo LaGuardia had been planned for LaGuardia Airport by the Port Authority. But the Port Authority house ran out of money. It's an old story. And some local residents knew about the aborted plan. And a local activist thought enlivening and otherwise dead space was called for, and this statue appeared. The sculptor shows a man of action, catching the mayor in mid-stride, bringing his hands together to make a point. LaGuardia was always railing against something, some injustice or corruption, said the sculptor. And where did the sculptor sign his work? Well, the tradition was not for artists to sign their works in the Renaissance, but when Michelangelo learned that his Pieta was being ascribed not to himself, but to a Milanese sculptor, he carved more than his name on the Madonna's cincture. He wrote, Michelangelo Buonarroti, a Florentine, made this. And here's a cheap plug for another entry. I write about the wonderful copy, unsigned, at St. Vincent Ferrer Church on Lexington Avenue, 66th, which can save you a trip to the Vatican in case you missed the statue at the 1964 World's Fair. Did any of you see it then? Remember, you were on a conveyor belt. I mean, if you caught a passing glimpse, you were lucky.
Yep.
Didn't Neil Estern do the?
Yes, he did. I think we're ahead of you.
The French Huguenot sculptor Hubert Lesieur signed his statue of Charles I, which is now a Charing Cross on the horse's left forefoot.
Esther.
Do you sign his name?
Yes.
On LaGuardia's cuff. Yes, the sculptor was Neil Esther, who, when asked why he put it there, said, well, it had to go somewhere. So yes, it is Neil's work.
And he still has the maquettes in his studio.
Now up to the Upper East Side. This medieval-like fortress on the east side of Madison Avenue between 94th and 95th was built in the 1890s for a mounted troop calling themselves the 1st New York Hussars, which had begun in 1884 as much as a social club as a military organization. And this was their riding arena. It's hardly on a scale with a polo field, although reduced scale polo matches were played there at least until the late 1950s. My father took me to see a polo match there. Squadron A was essentially built as an extension of this armory, the 8th Regiment Armory, which was on the west side of Park Avenue between 94th and 95th. Both it and the extension were designed by John R. Thomas, who was known for his probity and for bringing the jobs in at budget, unlike Tammany architects like Horgan and Slattery, who probably creamed 50% off the top of every gig they got. This is the Hall of Records. Because of his honesty, Thomas won the award for this. By the 1890s, the 1st New York Hussars had been incorporated in the National Guard, which in those days was a real anomaly. Although the government paid for the armories, the troops were self-supporting, and the gentlemen equestrians of the 1st New York Hussars provided their own horses and uniforms, de rigueur were busbies and tunics, bandoliers, swords and riding boots, and a horse and a place in which to stable it. And here they are in the Fifth Avenue Parade in 1899, celebrating Admiral Dewey's victory in Manila Bay. The troop went off to war in World War I, but cavalry charges became considered too suicidal, even by the bloody standards of that war, and the troop was reorganized as a machine gun battalion. By the 1960s, Hunter High School moved to the site, and both parts of the armory, the original Park Avenue wing and the Squadron A addition on Madison Avenue, was slated to be torn down. The Park Avenue wing did. A cry had gone up among preservationists, and in a last-ditch effort to save some of the castle. Whoops, I'm losing this, aren't I? In a last-ditch effort to lose some of the castle-like building, the Madison Avenue wall was preserved. Harmon H. Goldstone, the then commissioner of the Landmark Preservation Commission, said that it was the most interesting part of the building from an architectural point of view, which is about all he could say about this sad bit of preservation, because all the rest of it was already down. But on that wall is a plaque, and what it says is worth waiting for. It is not in Latin, which is the language which you usually associate military slogans, but in French, which was probably the lingua franca for the equestrians. It means push ahead or press forward, a perfectly appropriate message for a military troop. It was the family motto of this man, the lawyer Herbert Barry, who joined the troop in 1891 and rose through the ranks to become the regimental colonel. And here's the family motto and crest on the gates of the estate in Cobh, Ireland. The grainy photo is from Herbert Barry's obituary in the Times. He was the grandfather of Roxanna Robinson, bringing it back to Cornwall. Now here's a subway kiosk at Astor Place. That's Cooper Union behind it. And I'll bet that you think that this kiosk has been there since the IRT opened in 1904. I see one head shaking no. Now here's the subway kiosk at Astor Place. That's Cooper. No, I'm sorry, I just forgot to. Okay. Well, there had been one. There is this view from the early 50s show.
Mike,
Is this flopping down again? Is that working now?
Yes.
There had been one, as this view from the early 50s shows. And the Astor Place kiosk was double wide, serving both entering and exiting passengers. Unlike the average kiosks, which separated incoming from outgoing passengers. All of the kiosks, however, were cruelly destroyed by the 1960s. And the Astor Place, I went the wrong way. So how can you explain this one? The architect Rolf Olhausen, who had been a student at Cooper Union, fondly remembered the original kiosk. And when his architectural firm was given the plum assignment of modernizing the station, along with the graphic designer Milton Glaser, Olhausen put forward the idea of cloning the double-wide entrance. He had taken photos of the original kiosk, and he studied the original drawings. He traveled to Wall Street, to the station on Broadway, where on the corner of Rector Street is a variation on the kiosk's roof motif. But there's one thing that Olhausen didn't have to worry about. Can you make out what this says? It says, position of sewer vent varies. That's a surprising thing to find on a plan for a subway kiosk, isn't it? What's interesting is that the kiosks were artfully placed above the men's and women's rooms in the subway stations, and hollow posts were incorporated to serve as toilet vents. Down at the Astor Place subway station, the men's room was on the right and the women's room on the left. But Olhausen didn't have to worry about sewer vents above the men's and women's rooms when he was doing his kiosk, because by then the toilets had been taken out of the subway system, and in some instances newsstands were incorporated within, as you see here at Astor Place. And the door to the men's room is still there with the sign above it, and the door to the women's room is still there with the sign above it, but no sewer vent was needed. And here's the kiosk, perhaps on opening day in 1986, with Milton Glaser with his back to us, talking with the then president of Cooper Union. And Rolf Olhausen's firm, Prentice, as in Tim, Chan, and Olhausen. And the Prentice family used to live on, well, Nora still does, on Riverside Drive in sight of this statue. And their good friends live only, 11 blocks away from it. This is on 93rd in Riverside. I call this entry, I'll go back, I call this entry the Stones of Rouen. Because Joan of Arc had been imprisoned in this castle. And contrary to the caption, not all of the castle was destroyed in 1590. However, by 1912, the determination was that the balance would be destroyed, with this tower the only reminder. 1912 just happened to be the 500th anniversary of the birth of Joan of Arc, and a committee of New Yorkers, Francophiles all, wanted to erect a statue in her memory. When they learned that the walls that had imprisoned Joan were about to be taken down, they determined that some of the stones in Joan's prison would be just the thing to serve as the base of their proposed statue. In June 1914, which means just, 2 months before World War I began, 229 blocks left Rouen for New York. And here are some of the stones of Rouen serving as the base of the statue. The committee, this committee president was, George F. Kunz, the committee president, and he was perhaps the least affluent of the committee members, the poorest. He just happened to be the nation's foremost expert on precious stones and the head of the diamond department of this store. Does anybody recognize it? Does that statue of Atlas holding the clock remind you? This is Tiffany. And the building still stands. It's on the southeast corner of 5th Avenue and 36th. Kunz was also an honorary curator at the American Museum of Natural History and a special agent of the U.S. Geological Survey. He was a graduate of Cooper Union, and he was a patron of the National Sculpture Society, a member of the City History Club, and president of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, a proto-architectural preservation group. He knew the city, he knew sculpture, and the stuff it stands on. And he lived in the Henry Hudson Apartments on Riverside Drive between 110th and 11th, not far from where some of us lived. Another member was McDougal Hawkes, who was the director of the nascent Museum of French Art. He only had degrees from Columbia in engineering, political science, and law. Hawkes just happened to be married to Eva Van Cortlandt Morris of Morrisania, which means she was a member of the family that owned about a quarter of the Bronx. They lived at 8 East 53rd Street. In 1912, Hawkes hosted a luncheon at the Metropolitan Club, honoring a French delegation to celebrate the Champlain Tercentenary. This man, the former senator from Montana, William A. Clark, a.k.a. the Copper King, say the magic word, I lose my voice. We'll try again.
It's like a brush of whiskers for a brush.
Is this thing working?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the Cox King. He was on the committee and he was at the luncheon. And after the luncheon, the visitors went to Clark's modest house on the northeast corner of 5th Avenue and 77th Street.
Oh, right. Oh, my God.
Clark had 6 paintings of Joan of Arc by Boutet de Montville hanging on his walls. And this is the title page from a book illustrated by him on Joan of Arc. A year later, Hawkes hosted a reception for the French ambassador at the Ritz-Carlton on Madison Avenue between 46th and 47th Streets. Senator Clark was at the luncheon, along with J. Sanford Saltus, the committee's honorary chairman. Saltus was a patron of the arts in general. He established prizes at the Art Students League and the National Academy, but he was most interested in numismatics, and he established the Saltus Award for numismatics. He could afford it. His father owned and operated Saltus Steel. And this award is still being given. It was just given the other day. It's been 75 years now that it's been given. Of course, statues don't come cheap, and Saltus contributed $20,000 to the cause. In order to drum up more funds, Saltus arranged for the American Numismatic Society at Audubon Terrace to host what was billed, and this is a quote, as the most extensive exhibition of Joan material ever brought together anywhere in the world. It included about 1,000 articles, including one of Senator Clark's Bouquet de Monvelles, dozens of portraits and statues of Joan, medals and coins from prominent collectors, and Saltus himself contributed a collection of Joan of Arc medals, 12 gold, 93 silver, and 97 bronze, that he had specifically acquired for the occasion. Saltus died a mysterious death in London in 1922, and he was listed in the social register, and his address was a bank in Paris. But he did die this mysterious death in London. And in the same year, this book, Statues of New York, which as far as I can figure out was the first book devoted exclusively to the subject, was published with him as the lead author. As the lead co-author, sorry. And the statue itself, there never was any actual competition held, and the sculptor Anna von Hyatt seems to have been the odds-on favorite from the outset. Hyatt's father was a zoologist at MIT, and her natural proclivity was to sculpt animals. In 1900, at age 25, she came to New York to study. By 1906, one of her animal sculptures was already in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She had exhibited an equestrian Joan in clay at the Paris Salon in 1910, and Saltus had been there to see it. And that was all that was needed. She went to work at the family's vacation property in Annisquam, Massachusetts, and here's a view of the finished product from a similar perspective. Although the reins on her horse are loosely held, whoops, I'm just going to hold this. Is this going to work?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. Although the reins on her horse are loosely held, the horse's raised foreleg, the angle of his head, and his tense muscles all convey energy. And Joan stands forward in the saddle, the visor of her helmet raised, her eye on the hilt of the sword she holds on high. The cross guard of the hilt creates a cross, the perfect symbol for Joan. Whoops, wrong way. And the armor? The consultant on the armor was Bashford Dean. Dean had been fascinated by armor as a boy, but he started his professional life as a zoologist. He was an expert on the armored fish of the Devonian period, and he taught at Columbia, where he would wow his students. This is making a noise, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where he would, I'll try to loop it around again. If I take my glasses off, I won't be able to see anything. Where he would wow his ability to take a piece of chalk in each hand, go to the blackboard, and working simultaneously and with equal dexterity, draw an example of an armored fish. How many of you in the audience are left-handed?
Left-handed.
Only two?
Wow.
Does the word dexterity bother you? It comes from the Latin dexter,
Yes.
meaning right.
Yeah.
Why not sinisterity? I vote for that. A serious study of armor was a logical extension of zoology, and Dean became the first curator of armor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And here's another cheap segue into another subject. Ignore the cabs and hot dog stands and look at the building. Have you ever noticed those stones atop the paired columns?
Oh, yeah.
The stones of the Met were up there to be carved in situ. each group representing a period of art. The problem is that by the time they got around to carving the stones, the $1 million allocated for the east wing was used up. So the stones never were carved, and they've been there ever since. So if anybody has salt that's like money, contribute it. Give it to them. Back to Joan. The armor on Joan was modeled on the finest period of the armorer's art, 15th century Italian, and the model came from Dean's private collection. I gave this talk the other day, and somebody asked me if I thought that Joan's actual armor was 15th century Italian armor. And I must confess, I haven't a clue, but I doubt it. It was probably cheap off-the-shelf armor. But the model for this armor came from Dean's private collection. He lived on the grounds of Wave Hill in northern Riverdale. He could afford it. Dean is another who married into New York royalty. He married Alice Dykeman of Dykeman House. The protagonist who unwittingly set the stage for some of this story was Arthur Huntington, the stepson of the railroad man Collis P. Huntington, and heir to his fortune. It was Huntington who provided the land on Upper Broadway for Audubon Terrace, the setting for the Hispanic Society, which Huntington had founded, and it was the setting for the American Numismatic Society, the site of the Joan of Arc exhibition. And here's how the story comes full circle, with another royal marriage. In 1922, Huntington wanted to have a medal cast for one of the Argentine statesmen, Bartholomew Mitre, M-I-T-R-E. Huntington knew Hyatt's work, but he had never met her. When they did meet to discuss the project, something seemed familiar about her. And he asked if they had ever met. She said, yes, on the train coming from Westchester to Grand Central. We see each other every day. A year later, they were married, and West 12. Of course, she got the commission to do the medal honor in Mitre, and she created the statuary for the courtyard of Audubon Terrace, including the monumental equestrian of L.C. You probably know her as Anna Vaughan Huntington. I mean, that's the way, she's recognized today, but she cast Joan of Arc as Anna Vaughan Hyatt. Here we are at a vernal oasis in a neighborhood that bears the name of the park, Gramercy. And I write about this plaque on the sidewalk by the park's west entrance. Samuel B. Ruggles was one of those overachievers in the early 19th century. Born in 1800 at age 12, when later generations of 12-year-olds might be regarding I Love Lucy as high intellectual fare, Ruggles was already at that already mentioned college in Connecticut, Yale, and he was there at 14. He graduated at 14. By the time he was 21, he had been admitted to the New York bar. And a year later, he married Mary Rathbone, a graduate of the Moravian Seminar in Pennsylvania, and a daughter of John Rathbone, who had been wise enough to invest in Aaron Burr's The Manhattan Company, which purportedly was going to be a water delivery company, a reservoir.
Can you
But
pull the
there was a
microphone
contract.
on? Yeah, we have
We're
it's just so hard to hear.
Is this working?
Yes, it was backwards.
We'll have to put up with the crashes. But there was is this okay?
Yes.
But there was a deal struck with the state, and Aaron Burr was allowed to begin a bank. The Bank of Manhattan Company became today's Chase Manhattan. So his daughter was fairly well off. Ruggles was essentially a city planner before city planning was, and he thought that the street commissioner's map of 1811 had some serious drawbacks. The primary one among them being the paucity of open spaces for leisure activities. Why do you think there were so many crosstown streets in Manhattan vis-a-vis north-south avenues? Because what was the mode of transportation in the early 19th century? Water. South Street was the primary docking area, and the Hudson River, today's West Street, was becoming, by the mid-19th century. So to get produce from the East River to the Hudson, you needed a lot of cross-down streets, right? And one of the reasons that the street commissioners said that there weren't going to be a lot of open spaces was that we had the waterfront to frolic in. Well, if it's given over to business, what are you going to do, dive into the Hudson next to the Queen Mary? Trinity Church in the early 19th century had established a private park south of Canal Street, and they built St. John's Chapel on Varick Street, on the west side of Varick Street, which ironically found itself, well, not ironically, but it found itself without a congregation by the late 19th century, and it was ironically torn down to make way for the extension of the 7th Avenue line, the IRT, down Varick Street. And it's commemorated in the Chambers Street, in a mosaic in the Chambers Street subway station. But the chapel is long gone. Ruggles took a look at St. John's Park, and he thought, well, I'll do the same thing. And he had bought a farm which extended on sort of a northwesterly angle from about 20th Street to about Madison Avenue, from 20th to about 24th. And he laid out a private park, and he set about selling the lots around it. And if you bought one of the lots around it, you would have a key to the private park. And originally, your keys were gold. This was in the 1830s. There was a terrible financial panic in 1837. He didn't start really selling the property until the 1840s. You see 3 buildings here on Gramercy Park North. George Templeton Strong and his bride were presented with a house on the right by Strong's father as a wedding gift. Strong and his bride had been married at Grace Church, and while still a student of Columbia in 1836, which in those days was down on Park Place, Strong had started writing a diary. And his diary, the Strong Diary, is one of the best diaries on 19th century New York. The other is next to it on the bookshelf, the Diary of Philip Home, which is only 2 volumes. Strong's is 4. This is Gramercy Park West, and as you see here, there's some very grand cast iron entrances, some of which are still there. They're reminiscent of New Orleans. And the House with the Lamps was the home of James Harper, of Harper's Magazine and Harper and Row. And those lamps aren't just any lamps. We forget that James Harper had also been a mayor of the city of New York. And those are mayor's lamps installed because the mayor is the chief magistrate in the city. And if you want to find the chief magistrate at night, the lamps lit the way to the magistrate's house. And the building now occupied by the National Arts Club was designed by Calvert Vaux of Central Park fame, and he built it for a lawyer and a politician who just happened to be a great bibliophile. This was the domed reading light in one of his libraries in the house. He was Samuel J. Tilden, and he was a leading politician who helped break the Tweed Ring. In fact, some people said that he had an underground escape route exiting on 19th Street to flee from the mobs, but it was in reality a coal shooter delivery system. And he was the governor of New York State. In 1876, he was the Democratic. How am I making that noise? In 1876, he was the nominee for the Democratic Party, and his election was a forerunner of the election of 2000 without the hanging chads. If you remember the 1876 election, Florida was contested, and it finally went to the Republicans only because they were willing to spend more money than the Democrats were. And some of Tilden's interests are synthesized in some of these faces we see on the facade of the Tilden house, which include Shakespeare and Franklin, Milton and Dante, and Goethe. And this is the Gramercy Park Apartments, 34 Gramercy Park East, which was built in 1883, and it was one of the city's first cooperative apartment houses, and one of the first apartment houses built for the proper upper middle classes. And they're not here, some Cornwall folks used to live in the Gramercy apartments. Bessie and Stanford White moved into this house on the west corner of Lexington Avenue and 20th Street. And of course, White couldn't keep his hands off it. And this is the interior of White's house. Now you probably have a clue why he died in debt. But back to this plaque. Can you make out the name of the person responsible? It's John Ruggles Strong. Yes, George Templeton Strong, the diarist and Columbia-educated lawyer, had the good fortune to marry Ellen Ruggles, the only daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Ruggles, who had established Gramercy Park. Another link with Gramercy Park, Jane Garmey's late husband wrote a book on Gramercy Park, and there was a foreword by Paul Goldberger, who was the critic for the Times, and there were nice blurbs on the back from the bottom up. Columbia's Adolf Platschek, Louis Auchincloss, who was sort of the Edith Wharton of the mid-20th century, and Roger Rosenblatt. Roger is a playwright and author, and I know Roger because when I was a sophomore at Trinity, I dated a girl at Friends named Ginny Jones. And after Ginny and I had stopped going out, she started dating Roger, and they wound up getting married, and they are married to this day. And Roger wrote this book, The Boy Detective, A New York Childhood, in which he wrote about this building on Lexington Avenue between 25th and 26th Streets, where he said the neighborhood kids used to go to see the New York Knicks play basketball before the NBA got big. This kid here saw the Harlem Globetrotters play there. Does anyone know this building?
Yeah.
This is the 69th Regiment Armory. And if you've ever wondered where the Armory show had been shown, this was the place. This is the Armory. And just as Anna Vaughan Hyatt knew Grand Central, you probably know it, especially if you've taken Metro North into the city. But you might not know it from this view, from the bridge over 42nd Street, looking toward what is euphemistically called the elevated circumferential plaza. And on the Vanderbilt Avenue 42nd Street corner, on the elevated circumferential plaza, you find this eagle. And you find another one above the entrance to the Grand Central Markets on Lexington Avenue. And now, no doubt, you're wondering why they're there. They had originally adorned the second Grand Central on the site, and you can see them on the roof line. When that building was torn down and replaced by today's, the eagles metaphorically flew away to find new perches, and these two have been retrieved. We forget what Park Avenue looked like north of the station. So where did the train yard and all those tracks go? They are essentially still there. In fact, there are 2 levels of train tracks, and they're under the buildings or under Park Avenue itself. The buildings south of 50th Street are simply built above the tracks, at least as far as the Waldorf. And this photo was taken with the 49th Street wall of the hotel, only a few inches off to the right. You can actually look through the grates and see the tracks. And the fact that the Waldorf Astoria has no basement explains why the lobby is up one floor, reached by stairs or escalators, and that's a place where no sensible hotel architect would put a lobby. But the architects who were eminently sensible in this case had no choice. Does anybody remember the word for baggage in Latin?
Impedimenta.
Who said that? She's a shill. Impedimenta. What is a greater impediment to travel than having to schlep your impedimenta up a flight of steps? I mean, hotel design just doesn't have. And I realize with this photograph that we've almost come full circle. Does anyone recognize this building?
It's a library, isn't it?
What am I doing?
No.
Oh,
That's not
yes, this building. I need the pointer for this. Coming full circle. Does anyone recognize that building? The Manhattan Hotel. Meinecke's Hotel. I don't know about you, but I'm tired. So I'm quitting. If you have, you've got an hour's worth. So, if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
What was that building where the train tracks were going and then right in the middle? Yeah, that one, right in the white.
On the left,
Yeah.
Grand Central Palace.
Palace?
Grand Central, that's where they used to have the automobile show and the boat show.
Where is it?
It's gone now. It was between 45th and 46th on the west side of Lexington Avenue.
Ah,
What
Thank
happened
you.
to the track that ran to the Waldorf Astoria? Is it still there?
There's a siding built. And the story is that Franklin Roosevelt used to take a train down from Hyde Park. And his train, if he was going to the Waldorf, his train would pull in at that siding, which enabled him to get directly into an elevator and upstairs. The Waldorf still uses the siding. They have a boxcar there with china. And if the kitchen needs a monkey dish or something, they have a busboy go down and to the bowels of the Waldorf and go off to the boxcar and get the china.
that's ridiculous. That's crazy.
It's great.
That's amazing.
What's a monkey dish? I
Dish with the
forget.
monkey.
I call myself a busboy emeritus.
Into your mic so we can hear you.
Sorry. I'm sorry, I call myself a busboy emeritus. A monkey dish is a small, shallow bowl, and it's used for pickles and things of that nature.
Really?
Sorry.
it called a monkey?
Yeah, I don't know.
I have a theory. I have a theory that small shallow bowl would have been coins that a monkey might have had down the street in
Oh, that's good. Can I steal that?
Congratulations. Well, wow.
Any other questions that I can answer?
We'll make it up.
Takes a village to answer the question.
Okay.
When did they decide to build over the train tracks that
What?
paved the way for Park Avenue?
What enabled it?
When did
When did they decide to build over the train tracks?
Why? Oh, when? Sorry. The second Grand Central was there until 1910, and the decision was made not because the New York Central Railroad wanted to spend a lot of money needlessly. The history of Grand Central can go back to 1870. Until then, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt had steam engines, steam-powered trains operating at grade, going down the east side on 4th Avenue to Lower Manhattan on the west side down Varick Street all the way to Chambers Street. By the 1870s, the city council, the aldermen in those days, said, "Thou shalt bring no steam engines into Manhattan on the east side. They didn't give a fig for the west side. On the east side, south of 42nd Street. So 42nd Street as a drop-dead site was given to the Vanderbilts. So they proceeded to buy up every square inch except one holdout from 42nd to 50th Street, from Lexington to Madison Avenue. And and remember, trains were still operating at grade down Park Avenue. And it wasn't until they were put into a tunnel, it was sort of a tunnel, that Park Avenue took on any of the trappings of being Park Avenue. But there was a terrible accident. The tunnel was smoke-filled. The engineer missed the red light, and there was kaboom. It was a terrible accident. So the city entered the scene again and said, "Thou shalt bring no steam engines into Manhattan on the east side, period." So the Vanderbilt family was made to do something dramatic. Remember, if you took a train from Washington by the Pennsylvania Railroad, you were dumped on the Jersey side of the Hudson River. Princess Ogorsky, is that her name? In Age of Innocence? What was her name? There's a great bit in the Age of Innocence where the frustrated aspirant lover goes to meet her and has to go to New Jersey and escort her back. Or Baroness Ortsky? Is that her name? Anyway.
Olinsky.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So the Vanderbilts could have had a terminal in the Bronx. But, it's the Bronx. They didn't want that. They wanted to continue service into Manhattan. So they said, all right, we'll build a depot. The first Grand Central on the site was a depot. And some passenger cars were unhitched and taken down Park Avenue. You know the underpass from 39th Street South? That was originally for horse-drawn cars from Grand Central going down to a terminal point on the west side of Park Avenue over to Madison between 26th and 27th.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And that building was taken over by Phineas T. Barnum, who set up a circus there. And then that building was torn down, and the first Madison Square Garden was built on that site, and is today New York Life. So the first depot only went from 42nd to 43rd, and then there was a cast iron train shed, much like the train sheds you still see in Europe, for instance. And then there were open train yards from 45th to 50th. And by the 1890s, they doubled the size of the depot, not to accommodate more passengers, but to accommodate more paperwork. Then with the crash in the tunnel, and the city saying, "Thou shalt bring no steam engines into Manhattan," period, the fact that the New York Central had to electrify was thrust upon them. So they had an engineer named William J. Wilgus, who had taken one correspondence course in drafting from Cornwall. And that was the extent of his engineering education. But Wilgus was brilliant. And he said, look, all this property that we have that is laying fallow can be put to good use. And he understood that just as you can stand with an electric train operating between your legs, so a skyscraper can stand with trains operating between its legs, its posts. Remember, a skyscraper is not supported by its walls, but by a skeleton of steel with, I mean, just as your skin is doing nothing to support you, you're supported by a skeleton of bone with muscle and cartilage holding it all together. So a skyscraper is standing there thanks to its skeleton, and its skin is only keeping out the rain and keeping in the heat or air conditioning. So Wilgus said, look, we have all this property, put it to good use. We'll build a double-level terminal, and all trains that enter Grand Central terminate there. If I hear any one of you calling it Grand Central Station, I've
heard that before.
It's Grand Central. There are 3 Grand Central stations. There is the Flushing Line Grand Central subway stop. There's the Lexington Avenue. 4. There's the shuttle, and there's the post office that is also called Grand Central. But the building itself on Park Avenue and 42nd is Grand Central Terminal. So Wilgus said, look, we can have an enormous real estate development, and we will profit from land that was otherwise only having smoke and steam above the ground. So, I think just, hotels are frequently associated with railroads. Some of the great hotels in the Canadian Rockies were put up by the Canadian Pacific Railroad, for instance. The Biltmore Hotel, the Commodore Hotel, the Roosevelt Hotel, the Park Lane Hotel, and the one east of it, which is still going, and the name has just gone out of my head.
No, the Essex is up.
No, the Essex is down to 59.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter, go on.
Pardon
We'll
me?
think of it later.
Yeah. I'll call you at 3 in the morning. They put up some great apartment houses, 277 and 277 Park, which was built as a square courtyard house, and 270 and 290 Park, likewise. In fact, 290 was torn down to make way for the Union Carbide building, and the Union Carbide building is now threatened with destruction. I mean, it's incredible how, these things change. Actually, my first job was as a delivery boy for Gristedes in the days when Gristedes had fruit boxes delivered to the Queen Elizabeth. Imagine pushing a shopping delivery cart on Madison Avenue. It was awful. But anyway, that was in 290 Park. The Yale Club is built on New York Central property. The Gray Bar building. If you go into the Gray Bar building, the Office building, you go up a couple of, a flight of stairs. Why? Because the tracks are right under it. So that's how that huge development, it was called the gateway to the country, gateway to the nation. And it was all New York City, New York Central owned. I mean, my father managed hotels, and he was at the Park Lane, and both the Park Lane and the Biltmore. His check was not from the Park Lane and the Biltmore, it was from the New York Central Railroad. I'm being given the...
All by change, right? Yeah.
I just want to say briefly, I spent 4 hours the last few days at the Antique Machinery Show, and I have a fan that I used to live down in 29 John Street in Lower Manhattan. Someone threw a fan out in the hallway. Okay, big old brass fan, and a couple of them, they were DC. I saved this one, and it says ECK. Well, a few years ago I looked online, it's not a Westinghouse or General Electric, it's an ECK, and the ECK fan, which company went out of business, he was Swedish during World War I, that was the first oscillating fan, and it stopped working some years ago, so I put it in the bag and took it down to the machinery show and took it with the cart to talk to a guy who knows something about them. And he also knew all about Lower Manhattan. He used to fix copying machines. Anyway, if anyone wants to look at the old ECK fan, which is DC, and of that pre-World War I era, it's in my car.
John, I wanted to ask, nobody else has to hear this, but you know when the trains come out at 125th Street? Yeah, right, and when it goes over. Now, I was told there was an earthquake at some point, why the land
thank you.
is there and
Not to forget it, yeah.
when you cross, you know, that.
Got it all?
And I guess that's it for the John Tauranac talk on the New York subway system.
They have to be above ground.
Thanks.